Your leadership team thinks this is a rollout question. It isn't. This is a governance decision with a very short runway, and the pressure is on because Copilot doesn't wait for your policy cleanup or your internal alignment to catch up. Once it starts operating across your environment, it uses the system exactly as it finds it, and that's where this breaks. Most organizations with multiple Microsoft 365 tenants assume they have one AI control story, mostly because they buy from one vendor and manage one identity estate. They hear one strategic narrative from Microsoft and assume the reality matches the pitch. But the operating condition is very different. AI works at tenant boundaries while risk moves right across them. So the question isn't, can we enable Copilot everywhere? The real question is, what governance model lets us scale safely across tenants that behave independently? Before we get to that model, we need to define the trap. The trap: sovereign AI islands inside one enterprise. In most organizations, the illusion starts with familiarity. You open Microsoft 365, you open Purview, you open Entra, you open Power Platform. The branding is the same. The admin language feels connected, and the commercial motion tells a very clean story. One ecosystem, one strategy, one direction. But the control model underneath is not one thing, and that matters more than the branding. Based on the research here, there is no single global AI admin center with full feature parity that gives you one place to govern Copilot cleanly across all tenants. What you actually have is a fragmented control stack. Parts of governance live in Purview, other parts live in admin centers, and the rest is scattered across Entra and Power Platform. Some features are emerging in newer Microsoft control layers, but they don't yet form one complete, mature global plane across every tenant boundary. That gap creates false confidence. Leaders look at the ecosystem and assume centralization, while teams look at shared identity and assume consistency. Procurement sees one agreement and assumes one operating model, but each tenant still carries its own policy boundary and its own data boundary, which means in practice, each one carries its own version of the truth. So what's actually happening is simple. You don't have one enterprise AI environment. You have multiple AI environments that happen to belong to the same enterprise. That's a very different risk picture. One tenant might have stronger Purview coverage, while another has weaker label adoption or incomplete audit ingestion. From a board level, this might still look like one program, but from an audit or incident point of view, it is not one program at all. It is a collection of separate operating conditions. And once those conditions drift, reporting starts lying. Not intentionally, structurally. A central team asks, are we governed? One tenant says yes because audit is on, another says yes because labels exist even if coverage is weak. A third says yes because identity is connected. A fourth says yes because Copilot is technically deployed. Each answer sounds reasonable on its own, but none of them mean the same thing. That's the trap. You think you're looking at a global control plane, when what you're really looking at is a set of sovereign AI islands inside one company. They are connected in brand and sometimes in identity, but they are not governed as one system. And if you remember nothing else from this section, remember this line. There is no global AI admin center, only the illusion of one. Once that illusion breaks, the next problem shows up fast. Most organizations respond by doing governance tenant by hand, and they call that control. Why manual per-tenant governance collapses at scale. Once leaders see the boundary problem, the usual response sounds sensible. They say, fine, we'll govern each tenant properly. One admin team checks settings here, another team repeats them there. Someone keeps a spreadsheet, someone else builds a checklist. A steering group meets once a month and asks whether the rollout is on track. On paper, that looks disciplined. In practice, it's manual repetition dressed up as governance. And the reason it fails is simple. Repetition does not produce control, it produces variation over time. This happens because each tenant moves at a different speed, each admin reads standards a little differently, and local exceptions start to feel justified because the business wants progress now, not after another central review. This old model survives because it feels visible. People can point to tickets closed, policies created, and settings changed. They can show activity. But visible effort is not the same as a stable operating model, and with Copilot in the picture, that gap gets expensive very quickly. The system starts using existing permissions, existing content exposure, and existing labeling gaps the moment users begin prompting. That's the thing most people miss. Copilot does not wait for governance maturity. It runs on the permissions you already have, the content hygiene you already tolerate, and the audit posture you already failed to standardize. If one tenant cleaned up access and another delayed it, or if one tenant streams useful audit data while another barely captures enough for investigation, Copilot will expose those differences immediately. It doesn't happen in theory, it happens through use. If one tenant reviewed broad SharePoint access and another assumed it was good enough, the AI will find the gaps. And one level deeper, every new tenant multiplies the problem, not because tenants are bad, but because unmanaged differences compound. One new pilot team adds a local exception, a merger brings in another tenant with different labels, and a regional admin copies an old baseline. A business unit asks for faster access, and none of those choices look dramatic in isolation. Put them together over months, and you get policy drift, access drift, and rollout drift. The result is a governance team that spends more time reconciling differences than preventing risk. That's where manual control breaks. It feels safer because humans touch the settings, but it actually scales inconsistency because every touch point is another chance for tenants to diverge. The outcome is slower rollout where you want speed, more audit effort where you want evidence, and more rework where you want standards. Worst of all, it creates hidden exposure where leadership expects assurance. This clicked for me when I stopped treating governance as a setup task. It's not. It behaves more like decay. If you clean up permissions once, but no control keeps them from drifting again, the exposure returns. If you define a label taxonomy once, but tenants apply it unevenly, the baseline erodes. If you approve Copilot in waves without checking whether the underlying controls still hold, you're not scaling safely. You are just expanding faster than your governance can keep up. So the metric that matters here is access drift. Not just whether you remediated something, but how fast permissions spread again after remediation. That tells you whether your model is holding or slipping. Because governance is not a project you finish, it is a decay problem you manage continuously. And once scale breaks the old model, most leaders reach for the most familiar answer: identity. They assume if users can move cleanly across tenants, governance will somehow move with them. It won't. Why identity does not solve governance? This is where many programs take a wrong turn, because identity feels like the clean answer. If users can authenticate across tenants, if Entra is connected, and if cross-tenant settings are in place, leaders assume the hard part is solved. Access looks unified, sign-in looks unified, the architecture diagram looks tidy, but Copilot governance does not become unified just because identity can move. That assumption fails at the point where AI actually works. Copilot grounds responses inside the tenant context where the request runs, and Microsoft's own guidance is clear on this point. Microsoft 365 Copilot operates within the security and compliance boundary of the tenant, and it respects the permissions of the user in that specific tenant context. A user can switch context as a guest, yes, but Copilot is still scoped to one tenant at a time. It does not merge multiple tenants into one intelligent workspace for a single answer. So identity can traverse, governance does not. And once you separate those two, a lot of executive language starts to sound dangerously vague. Connected tenants, shared identity, unified experience. Those phrases may be directionally true for collaboration, but they are not the same as saying policy enforcement, data grounding, logging, and control validation now work as one system. That gap becomes even more obvious when you look at Copilot Studio multi-tenant mode because the preview tells a very specific story. Yes, multi-tenant use exists, and an agent hosted in one tenant can be used from another tenant. But end-user authentication in multi-tenant mode is not yet supported in preview. Guest users are not supported. Custom connectors are not supported. Graph and Microsoft 365 standard connectors are not supported. Multi-geo is not supported. Several analytics capabilities are not available. Conversation transcripts are turned off in that mode as well. That is not a mature cross-tenant governance fabric. That is a bounded preview with clear limits. And those limits matter because they break the story many leadership teams tell themselves. They hear multi-tenant and assume operational maturity. Their architects hear cross-tenant and assume policy symmetry. Their control teams hear same vendor and assume audit consistency. Then the rollout begins, and people discover different behavior, missing signals, and awkward gaps around authentication and analytics. Picture the second case. A global company sets up cross-tenant Entra relationships and assumes the user experience will naturally extend into Copilot use. The expectation sounds reasonable, involving shared directory trust, smoother access, and common identity patterns. But when teams test actual Copilot and agent scenarios, the behavior is uneven. Some data appears only in switched contexts. Some expected connectors are unavailable. Some audit expectations don't line up with what preview features actually expose. Leadership still hears connected, while the controls team starts finding exceptions. That's not a technical edge case, it's a governance misread. Because auditors don't check your architecture story, they check evidence. They ask where prompts ran, which tenant enforced policy, what logs exist, and whether your controls were actually comparable across the environments you described as linked. If your operating model treated identity as governance, you won't have a clean answer. So if you remember one line here, make it this: cross-tenant identity is not cross-tenant intelligence. Identity helps users get in. It does not tell you whether Copilot behavior is governed consistently, monitored properly, or safe to scale across all the places your enterprise now calls one environment. And once that becomes clear, the answer can't be more tenant connections. It has to be architecture. The governance model that actually works, hub and spoke. So what does a real governance model look like when your platform is fragmented, identity is only partial, and tenant boundaries still actually matter? It looks like a hub and spoke system. I'm not suggesting this because the diagram looks clean on a slide, but because it actually matches the messy operating conditions you are dealing with right now. You need one central place where governance decisions are designed, measured, and enforced as a single system, and then you need local tenant teams to execute those decisions. These local teams have to work inside their own boundaries without inventing their own version of the rules every time they feel a little bit of pressure. We have to start with the hub. The hub is not an admin portal, it is not a shiny dashboard, and it definitely isn't a heroic central team jumping into every single tenant to clean up files manually. Instead, the hub acts as the ultimate governance authority. This group owns the policy design, the audit baselines, the label standards, and the rollout criteria. They are the ones who decide what ready for Copilot actually means, what evidence counts as proof, and how fast a security gap has to be closed. That shift changes the entire conversation. Because of this structure, global stops being a word for one magical screen and starts meaning one unified governance system. You get one standard for purview controls, one standard for how you ingest audits, and one standard for your sensitivity labels. There is one clear bar for what must be true before any specific tenant is allowed to expand Copilot access to more users. Then you need the spokes. The spokes are your local tenant execution teams who take that baseline and apply it to their specific environment. They are the ones running the remediation, validating the logs, and reviewing broad access permissions. However, they do all of that work inside a very narrow design space rather than a free-for-all. If a local team needs to deviate from the plan, there is a formal path for exceptions, and if they want to move faster, they still have to meet the shared controls first. When regional or legal differences pop up, those issues get documented and approved instead of being quietly absorbed into some local workaround that nobody else knows about. This structure is vital because fully centralized models usually choke on local details, while fully local models drift into total inconsistency almost immediately. Hub and spoke avoids both of those failure patterns. The hub gives you the consistency you need, while the spokes give you the execution speed where the work is actually happening. Let's make this concrete. At the hub, you define the minimum purview control set every tenant must run before Copilot is allowed to grow. You define exactly which audit events you expect to see and how often you will review them. You also create a shared label taxonomy for sensitive content so that a confidential tag does not mean 5 different things across 5 different tenants. You set the rhythm for reviews, perhaps monthly for your overall security posture, and more frequently in areas where the rollout is currently active. At the spoke, your team maps those high-level standards to the reality of that specific tenant. They find which sites still have broad access exposed and which business units are lagging behind on their labeling. They check if the audit is actually turned on and if the right records are visible to the security team. They look for local admins who might have introduced exceptions that were never officially reviewed, and they decide if a pilot group can safely expand or if they need to stop and fix things first. And here's the hard rule, because without a rule, this model is just a suggestion instead of actual governance. No Copilot rollout happens in any tenant without validated audit logging, a completed oversharing scan, and a minimum baseline for label coverage. I am not talking about these things being planned or partially discussed. They must be validated. If a tenant cannot prove those 3 conditions are met, the rollout pauses. That might sound strict until you compare it to the massive cost of cleaning up a mess after users start finding sensitive content you never meant to expose through AI. When you look at it that way, these rules are just basic common sense. Another reason this model works so well is the timing. The longer you wait to set this up, the more cleanup debt you are creating for yourself later. Every tenant that rolls out ahead of the baseline becomes another massive backlog of exceptions and missing evidence that your team will eventually have to unwind. Leaders often treat governance as something that can mature after adoption is finished, but in a multi-tenant Copilot world, that sequence is completely backwards. Governance has to lead the rollout, or the rollout will create more debt than your teams can ever hope to absorb. If you are leading this at an enterprise level, your next move is very clear. Stand up the hub right now and define that baseline today. Assign your spokes and put your exception handling process in writing immediately. You have to make global mean that your decisions and your rollout gates work as one single system, even when the tenants themselves do not. A model only matters if it actually changes what gets enforced tomorrow morning. What leaders should measure before they scale? A governance model only holds together if it produces measurements that everyone shares. Otherwise, every tenant will claim they are making progress in their own language, and leadership will get status updates without having any real control. Before you scale Copilot any further, you need a small set of metrics that tell you if the architecture is behaving the way you think it is. Activity levels won't tell you the truth, and adoption numbers definitely won't show you the risks. You should start with oversharing reduction. This is still one of the most obvious signs that your environment is actually becoming safer for AI. You need to look at broad access groups, open SharePoint sites, and old permissions that grant way more access than the business actually needs. The goal here isn't to hit a perfect number, but to prove that your exposure is moving down before your Copilot reach moves up. If those 2 lines are moving in opposite directions, you are expanding much faster than you are fixing the underlying problems. The second metric you need is observability coverage. Can you actually see what Copilot is doing across all your tenants in a way that supports a real investigation? Most research points to Microsoft Purview as the main place where core records like Copilot interaction are stored, but that assumes you have auditing turned on everywhere. Coverage is not something you can just assume is working. You need to know exactly which tenants have audit ingestion active and which ones are still leaving you with partial visibility. If you have no logs, you have no governance and no accountability. That sounds blunt because it has to be. If a tenant cannot provide usable evidence of what is happening, that tenant is not ready to scale safely. You cannot govern what you are not allowed to inspect, and you certainly won't be able to defend your actions if something goes wrong later. The third metric is your time to policy across all tenants. This is where leadership finds out if the hub and spoke model is actually real or just decorative. A central decision means absolutely nothing if one tenant enforces it this week while another waits a month to think about it. You should measure the time it takes from a policy being approved to that policy being effectively enforced in every single tenant. I'm not talking about the time it takes to announce it or document it, but the time until it is actually live. For an AI program that moves this fast, that kind of delay is just another word for risk. A practical target for most organizations is under 72 hours for standard changes. If your cycle time is much longer than that, you don't have a scalable model yet, you just have a coordination problem that needs to be solved. Next, you need to look at your label coverage ratio. Do not let this turn into a vanity metric where one tenant hits high numbers while the others fall behind. What really matters is whether your sensitive content is labeled consistently enough that Copilot's behavior isn't just based on user guesswork. You aren't looking for perfection here, but you are looking for a comparable level of control across every tenant in the organization. Finally, you need to track your access drift rate. This metric tells you whether your cleanup efforts are actually sticking over time. After you finish a remediation project, how quickly do those permissions start to spread again? How often do those broad groups crawl back into the system? Many teams realize this too late because they measured the fix once and assumed the problem was gone forever. It wasn't. The only metric that matters is how fast the system starts to slip once you stop looking at it. That is your operating dashboard. You need to track oversharing reduction, observability coverage, time to policy, label coverage, and access drift. The rhythm of your reporting matters just as much as the numbers themselves. The hub should own the executive dashboard because leadership needs one single view of the entire posture. Meanwhile, the spokes should own the remediation because the actual work has to happen where the tenant boundary lives. One team reads the system and the other team corrects it. You must track these numbers before you expand, not after the fact. The risk isn't waiting for your next meeting or governance workshop. It is already active in every tenant where Copilot can find exactly what your current controls are still allowing it to see. The two patterns leaders keep missing. I keep seeing two specific patterns in the field, and they both happen because leaders treat Copilot like a software launch instead of a major control event. The first pattern starts when an organization rolls out Copilot before setting a real purview baseline or reviewing their SharePoint access. On day one, the rollout looks perfect. Licenses are assigned, users are excited, and the internal messaging is all about productivity. But then, normal prompts start pulling up material that was technically accessible all along but practically invisible to the average employee. Before AI, nobody spent their day clicking through old sites, stale folders, or inherited permissions to find things they shouldn't see. But now they don't have to. A user asks a basic question, a summary comes back, and a file appears. Maybe it's sensitive HR content or finance material or deal information that was supposed to stay within a very tight circle. There was no breach, no malware, and no broken security boundary in the traditional sense. The system simply used the permissions and the content state that the tenant already allowed. That is the moment many teams finally understand the problem. AI didn't create the exposure, it just removed the friction that used to hide it. Once that happens in one tenant, executive confidence usually drops across the entire organization because nobody can say for sure where that same pattern might show up next. The incident might look local, but the damage to trust is enterprise-wide. The second pattern is quieter, but it is just as dangerous. A company sets up cross-tenant identity relationships, hears that multi-tenant scenarios are possible, and assumes their operating model is mature enough for a broad rollout. On a slide deck, that sounds like a solid plan. In reality, the operations get messy. One team expects a smooth Copilot experience across every connected environment, while another expects comparable visibility, and a third assumes the same controls will follow the user everywhere. Then actual usage starts exposing uneven behavior, gaps in authentication, and weak spots in what can actually be measured. The problem isn't that these teams were being careless. The real issue is that they translated connectivity into assurance. That assumption creates a false story about compliance. Leadership hears the word connected and assumes the organization is ready. Months later, control reviews find that behavior, evidence, and enforcement varied much more than anyone wanted to admit at the start. Now compare that to a better pattern. A different organization chooses to slow down before they scale up. They set a label baseline first, they review broad access first, and they validate their audit visibility before doing anything else. They expand Copilot in waves, not because they are afraid of adoption, but because they want every wave to produce usable evidence before the next one starts. That organization usually moves faster in the long run because they aren't constantly stopping to explain surprises, clean up exposed content, or argue about what governed was actually supposed to mean. That is the upside most leaders miss. Good governance doesn't block your rollout. It removes the drag from the rollout after that first wave is finished. The trap isn't adoption itself. The trap is unmanaged adoption across tenants that look connected from a distance but behave very differently when you get up close. The decision you have to make is actually very simple. You need to move to a federated hub-and-spoke AI governance model now, and you have to stop mistaking tenant by tenant toggling for actual control. You should pause your Copilot expansion in any tenant that cannot prove its logging, its oversharing reviews, and its label baseline coverage. AI is going to follow the system you actually built, not the org chart you report to. If this changed how you think about multi-tenant Copilot governance, follow me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn, and share this with your team if you are dealing with these issues right now.